Thank you. Well, thank you, Prof, for that very interesting talk. Just a few comments. I thought, the whole example of Hinduism was very extremely interesting. To learn that it was essentially a European construct, something new to me. And here I think we can draw a parallel. I know we're drawing parallels, but to how the Malay identity is constructed. In essence, what we understand as Malays today was in fact defined by the British through the Malay Reservations Enactment in 1912 or something like that, where they actually defined the Malays. And I suppose this, if you look at it, is the danger of defining a race through the lens of another race. Because before that, what you had were Javanese, Portuguese, and everything else, Cabals and so on. And suddenly you had this legal definition of what qualifies you to be Malay. And so I suppose that's I thought, yeah, it's a parallel. it's a valid parallel, yes. Very interesting. I also agree, I suppose, when we say we compare, the comparison of, what can be called, what people are calling Protestant Islam with Protestant Reformation movement in Europe is not a case of comparing apples to apples, obviously. It's a completely different thing, but I think we can agree that certainly there is a need to reform. There is a need to reform, lest we be dominated by what you say, rising Islamic fundamentalism, so on and so forth. So we'd like to open up for Q&A. Before that, perhaps I just have one question, and maybe we can start with that question. And after that, we'll take some questions from the audience. You mentioned, and which is true, Islam has no church in a sense. However, what is your take on perhaps how Islam is institutionalized, for example, in Malaysia? Is that, to me, I feel it's sort of like an attempt to create some kind of authority or church-like authority in the religion. For example, ban on yoga and so on. They're basically telling us how to practice our own religion. What is your comment on that?
I agree with you that when religion is institutionalized, there's an attempt to impose a certain interpretation on people, although it's not like a church. But the difference is that, as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, when you have certain rulings or certain decrees, you are bound to follow it. Whereas we are not bound as Muslims to follow. They are following secular law in that sense. You see, for example, they say a fatwa is gazetted, but that's nothing to do with Islam. There's no such thing in Islam. So if in Islam, let's say, a particular religious scholar says that abortion is unlawful, you may not follow him, you may follow another scholar who has a different view. Right? There's no central authority in Islam who will say that this is what the rule is and all Muslims have to follow. Right? It's really based on differences of opinions, other than the fundamentals, which is another matter.
Thanks. I'd like to open up questions to the floor. Please introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Anas Daniel. I am with the Islamic Renaissance Front. My first question would be furthering the idea of institutionalization of religion, especially in this case of Islam, as highlighted by Mr. Zaidan just now, where institutionalization of religion through government efforts, such as by having Jawi or Ma'ib in Malaysia, for instance, that is one case. Also at the same time, what about the situation where people in general are seeing their local ustads, local preachers as the source of authority, and the only source of knowledge on Islam, and internalizing whatever they think, whatever was spoken by their preachers or ustads, in a very taqlid manner in Islam. And that is still even happening today. While we did have Muslim reformers going against this, because in any way, this clearly is a show that we, in a way, as Muslims, when we start taking our local preachers, our ustads, it's just like what Rasulullah has warned us, that we are taking these people just like how the Jews and how the Christians took their clerics and rabbis as their gods. And it is still prevalent here today. And my second question is actually referring to what you have mentioned in your article, Contemporary Muslim Revival, Case of Protestant Islam. You divided those two articles on part 1 and part 2. While what I found just now, your focus on what you are presenting tonight is mainly focused on the part 1 of the article. I would like to ask something from the part 2 of your article, where you concluded that Muslim reformers such as Abdul and Rashid Ridha have failed in their efforts to reform the Muslim society, as like they try to have a new, perhaps this is what you mentioned, that having a different lens on looking at yourself through the lens of others. But I beg to disagree with that fact, because that what Abdul and what Rashid Ridha, and of course their earlier mentor Jamaluddin Al-Afghani, was trying to bring back Muslims to the real fundamentals of Islam. They never mentioned that they are deviating from Al-Quran, Sunnah, Ijma' and other traditions of Islam. They are in their efforts to reform the Islamic Ummah. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me begin with the second question. I don't think I said that Abdul and Rashid Ridha failed. That's your interpretation of it. I don't think I said that. But what I was saying is, and I also said it elsewhere, that you see, Muhammad Abdul and Rashid Ridha, they were modernists, right? Now there are many good things about what they said, but they also, their views also resulted in a negative attitude towards tradition, which I think eventually resulted in the Salafi movement, particularly Rashid Ridha. Right? So the Salafi movement is a movement that is anti-tradition, and it is the root of our problems. It's one of the roots of our problems. I mean, not everything, of course, is due to them, but it is certainly a very important root of our problem. You see, people like Muhammad Abdul and Rashid Ridha, their idea was that Muslims were bogged down by tradition, by superstition, by practices that were, Christians over the centuries, that were unnecessary, that were irrational, and so on and so forth. Now, I think it was an overkill, because it resulted in strengthening the anti-traditionalist, particularly the anti-Sufi movements, and the result was removing spirituality from Islam, from Muslims. The modernist impulse did that. Okay, the modernists said we must have modern schools, we must teach science, mathematics, English, and so on. It's very good, of course. But they tended to neglect. In some cases, it was a benign neglect. In other cases, it was hostility towards the Islamic sciences, particularly towards philosophy, theology, Sufism, Tasawwuf. This was the negative impact of modernism. And now, the so-called, the proverbial chickens are coming home to roost. Our religious departments are filled with people who are not rooted in Islamic tradition. When I say tradition, I don't mean that they don't have knowledge or learning. Okay? What I mean is the Islamic tradition in terms of literature, arts, poetry, qasida, for example, the Sufi tradition, which is the tradition of Islam in this region. We are gradually turning our backs on it. And this is, I'm saying it is a problem, not simply because we feel nostalgic towards our tradition, but because there are very serious consequences from neglecting the tradition of spirituality and religion. You see, throughout Islamic history, there has been a divide between people who stress the balance between spirituality and law. On the one hand, these are the Sufis. Later on, they were called the Sufis, but this is from the very early days of Islam. This is what Islam was about. That, in the Malays or the Muslims say it's Zahir and Batin, meaning that the life of a Muslim has to be based on this balance between following the rules and regulation on the one hand, but having the right spiritual and psychological predisposition on the other hand. In other words, mere practice of the rituals, following the rules and regulations is meaningless unless it is accompanied by the appropriate spiritual, psychological attitude. Then you have the group that stress only on the externalities, the rituals, the law. Right? Wahhabis and Salafis, for example. Even the proponents of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. Or in Iran, in the 16th century, you had a group called the Zahiris, just focusing on the externalities. Now, it is the group that focus on the externalities that are becoming more and more influential today. And it is a very dangerous development because, see, the group, like the Sufis and the other traditionalists, when they look at God, okay, let's just focus on perception of God. When they look at God, they see God in terms of all the attributes of God. God as not just somebody who punishes you, or somebody who loves you. God as a being full of mercy and grace, graciousness, knowledge, and so on and so forth. It's a holistic view of God. Now, the people who stress on rules and regulations, their view of God is God as a punitive being, as a terrible, what do we call it, scary father figure. And that understanding of God is internalized by them. That's why invariably these people tend to be authoritarian in their attitude in politics. Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Salafis, Wahhabis tend to be authoritarian in their politics. Probably because it is a reflection of the authoritarian personality that they had, which is a reflection of the authoritarian view of God that they had. You yourselves, those of you who are Muslims, you know when you study religion when you're kids, fear is ground into you. Am I right? Fear. That's not part of the Islamic tradition to teach fear about God. You know, the poet Jalaluddin Rumi, if you're familiar with Rumi, if we follow Rumi, and Rumi was very strict about law. He was a Hanafi, he followed the Hanafi school. He was very strict about law, but balanced with spirituality. If we follow Rumi, we will look forward to death. Nothing to be afraid of. Why? Because Rumi said, death is the wedding night. You know, in his Masnavi, in his series of poems, he called it Shab-e Arus in Persian. Shab-e Arus. It means the wedding night. Why? Because it is you're being reunited with your beloved, the one that loves you. So it is something that you look forward so much to. He's trying to convey that idea of looking forward to death. What better way of conveying that idea than to liken it to, the night that you are going to be united with the one that you love, the wedding night. So he calls it Shab-e Arus, the wedding night. Because the stress on God is the one who loves, not the one who's just waiting for you to mess up and punish you. So there's a fundamental difference between the more traditionalistic way of looking at God and human beings and civilization and creation and so on, as opposed to the more modernist way, which is really uprooted from the spirituality, from spiritualism. So that was your first question. And I think Abdul and Rashid Rida, for all the good things that they said and did contribute to this, um, the, what do you call it, uprooting of spiritualism. The first question was about institutionalization. You see, I think that the problem is not institutionalized Islam versus the Islam of the free-floating, ulama, the local preachers and so on. The problem is orientation and attitude. You must have institutionalized religion. It is needed. You need some standardization. You need some administration. That, I think, that much we need. The problem is, who are the people in the departments of religion in this country? What is their training? Where did they study? What kind of orientation do they have? And the same thing with the ulama, the one you're talking about, the local ulama, the ones who are not attached to government departments, to religious departments. The problem is the orientation. Whether it's institutionalized or not is not an issue. You have orientation that are very backward and orientation that are progressive. And this is a perennial struggle. And it happens in Christianity, it happens in Judaism, it happens in all religions. And the problem in this country is that, let's face it, the backward orientations are in power in the religious departments. If you look at Syria, if you look at Turkey, if you look at Morocco, the muftis in these countries, you cannot compare with the situation here. They don't make rulings like our muftis here, because they are more learned and they are rooted in tradition. They're not modernists. This is the problem. The problem is to have more learned religious leaders. I'm sorry to say, it's our politicians that have caused the problem, because in the 80s, they sent all these people to study abroad. And they probably sent the wrong people to the wrong universities, the wrong Islamic universities. And now these people have come back, and now they must be in their 40s and their 50s, and they are occupying the high positions in the various departments of the Jabatan Agama in the various states. Some of them are muftis, other religious officials, and they are coming up with such ideas and such rulings. That's, to me, the problem.